Greetings. I'm Ingo Pies, Professor of Economic Ethics at Martin Luther University Halle-Wittenberg. I'm thrilled to share some exciting news about a new publication. We've harnessed the power of artificial intelligence to transform it into an audio podcast just for you. It offers a wonderfully lively and insightful overview of the core ideas. My suggestion? Just give it a listen. You might find your interest piqued. We've also included a link to the corresponding PDF file. Have fun.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something pretty crucial for anyone who wants to understand, how our societies actually work. It's this idea that moralizing our political disagreements, that whole good versus evil thing, might actually be doing more harm than good.
Interesting.
Yeah, right? I mean, think about it. How often do you see political debates turn into these, moral crusades? It's, everywhere.
It's definitely a trend.
Right. And our goal today is to figure out why that kind of framing, that moral framing, can be, toxic for democracy.
And to do that, we'll be drawing on the work of Professor Ingo Pies. He's a scholar of economic ethics.
Yes. And his analysis is, I'm going to get the title right here. Yeah. Moralizing Politischer Discourses Gift für die Demokratie, which, for those of us who don't speak German, translates to the moralization of political discourses is poison for democracy.
Catchy down.
Right. Gets right to the point. Anyway, his main argument, and the one we'll be unpacking, is that while morality and politics are, of course, linked, you can't really separate them when we start treating our political opponents as if they're, morally bankrupt or evil. We actually undermine the very processes we need to, solve problems together, which at the end of the day is what we're all trying to do, right?
Absolutely. It's interesting. Right from the start, Pies reminds us that democracy, at its core, is all about making sure political power serves the common good. And those interests, those things we all strive for, peace, prosperity, human dignity, those are fundamentally moral concerns.
Right, exactly. So there's this inherent link between the two.
There is. And as Pies notes, that link in itself is a good thing. The problem arises, as we'll explore, when that link is weaponized, so to speak, against your political adversaries.
Okay, so to understand how this all works, let's look at how Pies frames democracy itself. He uses this model called a principal-agent relationship. So basically, in this model, you, the citizen, are the principal, and the politicians you elect, they're your agents. And for this whole thing to work for you, Pies says there are two key things that need to happen. First, there's what he calls self-enlightenment, which basically means all of us collectively need to figure out what we actually want. What do we as a society want to achieve? What are our goals?
Makes sense.
Right. And then there's this second part, which is called self-steering. And that's all about making sure our elected officials, those agents we were talking about, actually act on those wants that we've, collectively identified.
Okay, so two parts: figuring out what you want and then making sure your representatives actually do it. Got it.
Exactly. Now, Pies goes further and breaks down where these two functions actually take place. So self-steering, that act of making your collective will binding, that happens primarily in the political arena, through elections.
Right, the voting booth. That's where you have a direct say.
Exactly. And you can think of elections as this, feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
It's a mechanism for us to correct course if our agents, the politicians aren't meeting our expectations, they fail to represent our interests, boom, we vote them out.
It's like a built-in error correction system.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the self-enlightenment part, the process of figuring out what we want that happens in what Pies calls the discursive arena, basically the realm of public debate.
Okay, so that's where the ideas get hashed out.
Exactly. It's where we all, in theory, at least get to voice our opinions on, what the common good means, what our priorities should be, what we might be missing.
So it's like this ongoing process of collective self-understanding.
Exactly. And it's constantly being shaped by, the media, academics, interest groups, even just everyday citizens like you and me.
It's where we exercise our freedoms of speech and thought, ideally.
Right. And here's the really interesting part. Pies actually calls this discursive arena the control center of democracy.
The control center.
Yeah, because the expectations and understandings that come out of these public debates, they end up heavily influencing what happens in the political arena.
So what we're talking about, discussing, arguing about in public, that shapes what politicians actually do.
Exactly. So successful self-steering, getting those politicians to act in our interests, relies on us first figuring out what those interests are through open discussion, which, as Pies points out, is a pretty demanding task for everyone involved.
So no pressure, right?
Yeah, no pressure at all. Okay, so to really get into the nitty-gritty of this, Pies makes this a really interesting comparison between markets in the economy and political markets.
Okay, two different kinds of markets. How so?
Yeah, so on the surface, they seem similar, right? You have companies competing for customers, and then you have political parties competing for votes.
Makes sense.
But Pies points out this fundamental difference. In economics, you're mostly dealing with private goods, things you buy and consume individually.
Right, like a cup of coffee or a new phone.
Exactly. But in politics, we're dealing with public or club goods. These are things that affect all of us, whether we actively chose them or not.
Okay, so the difference is in what's being sold, so to speak.
Right. And this difference has huge implications for how those feedback mechanisms we talked about actually work. So in economic markets, the main way we give feedback is through exit, meaning if you don't like a product, you simply don't buy it.
Simple as that.
Right. Sometimes you might do some research beforehand, like reading reviews.
I do that all the time.
Right. But the key is, it's an individual decision. You make your choice, and collectively, those choices tell companies what's working and what's not.
Okay, so the market responds to individual choices. But how does that work with political markets?
Yeah, so Pies says that politics is different. Because those decisions about public goods are collectively binding, they affect every single one of us. We need more than just exit, or in this case, casting our vote.
So voting isn't enough.
Well, it's necessary, but it's not enough. We also need what he calls voice public discourse. We need to talk to each other, debate, figure out what we want as a society before we can effectively demand it through the ballot box.
So you can't just vote no on something you don't like. You need to articulate why, explain your position, and try to persuade others.
Exactly. And Pies really emphasizes this point. Politics relies on a functioning public sphere for that collective self-understanding.
Without it, you just have a bunch of individuals shouting their preferences with no real sense of shared direction.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now we get to, the meat of this whole discussion. Pies outlines these two core functions of the public sphere. And the first one is to, facilitate that collective self-understanding we talked about, but also, and this is important, to build consensus.
So not just figuring out what we want, but actually agreeing on it to some extent.
Exactly. But here's the thing, and Pies is really clear about this. It's not about achieving total agreement on every single political goal. In a diverse democracy, that's basically impossible. And honestly, it's probably not even desirable.
So what kind of consensus are we talking about?
Okay, so there are two levels to this. First, we need consensus on the fundamental rules of the game, the democratic processes themselves. We have to agree on how we make decisions as a society.
That makes sense. You can't have a democracy if everyone's constantly fighting over the rules.
Exactly. And second, we need some level of agreement on, these overarching moral aims. Things like peace, freedom, justice, things that benefit everyone. But those are pretty broad, right? It's when you get into the specifics that things get tricky.
So we don't need everyone to agree on every single policy or law.
No, not at all. In fact, Price talks about this idea of value dissensus. He basically says that disagreements between, say, progressive and conservative viewpoints, those are actually a good thing.
Disagreement is good. That's an interesting take.
Yeah, it is. But Pies argues that these opposing views act as, checks and balances on each other. He even references John Stuart Mill, who said, you need both a party of order and a party of progress to keep things healthy.
So it's this tension between different viewpoints that actually helps us move forward.
Exactly. It's like that saying, iron sharpens iron. It's the friction, the debate that helps us refine our ideas and avoid going too far in one direction.
So this antagonism, it's not a bug in the system, it's actually a feature.
Yeah, that's how Pies puts it. And I think it's a really useful way to think about it, because when you see it that way, you realize that this competition between political opponents, when it's done within certain norms, of course that's actually how we get to better outcomes.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the second function of the public sphere?
Right. So the second one is all about keeping the pressure on, our elected officials. And this pressure needs to be there throughout their entire time in office, not just before elections.
So it's not just about voting them in or out, it's about holding them accountable constantly.
Exactly, and this is where the opposition parties and even critical voices in the media come in. You see, they have a vested interest in, watching what the government does, pointing out mistakes, offering alternative solutions.
So they're like the watchdogs.
Exactly. And by making their criticisms public, they keep the governing party accountable to public opinion.
Okay, so we have this constant back and forth between the government and the opposition, and it's fueled by public discourse.
Right. And this back and forth, it disciplines both sides. It shapes their ideas and it influences their actions. It's like this continuous feedback loop of accountability.
Okay, I'm following you.
Yep.
So now we have this pretty clear picture of how democracy is supposed to work with these two interconnected arenas, the political one and the discursive one.
Right. And now we get to Pies's main argument, the thing that's so relevant for us today. How moralizing political discourse throws a wrench into the whole thing. He uses this term, Diskursversagen.
Diskursversagen.
Yeah, it's German for discourse failure. And it basically means that the free and open exchange of ideas between different political camps, it breaks down.
Okay, so the conversation grinds to a halt. Why does that happen?
Well, Pies says it happens when we start labeling our opponents as morally bad.
That whole good versus evil thing we were talking about at the beginning.
Exactly. When we do that, we stop engaging with their arguments and we just focus on demonizing them. And when that happens, productive conversation becomes almost impossible.
Right. It's like you're saying, I don't even need to listen to you because you're a bad person.
Yeah, exactly. Pies has this really great term for this tendency, monstrositates imagination. It's the tendency to attribute the worst possible motives to people we disagree with politically.
So instead of disagreeing with their ideas, we assume they have bad intentions.
Exactly. And Pies gives some really good examples of this. Like, remember the initial response to the corona crisis? Some experts, like the ones who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, they offered alternative approaches to lockdowns.
I remember that. It was pretty controversial.
It was. And a prominent government advisor, Christian Drosten, he dismissed their arguments as sabotage.
Wow, sabotage is a pretty strong word.
It is. And Pies points out that language like that, it doesn't engage with the actual substance of the criticism. It just paints the dissenting experts as, like, malicious actors.
So it shuts down the debate before it even really begins.
Exactly. And then another example he uses is the framing of Russia's war against Ukraine as unprovoked. Obviously, what Russia did was wrong. No one's arguing that. But Pies argues that this kind of absolute blame, it can prevent us from examining, any potential Western role in the lead up to the conflict.
Right. It simplifies a very complex situation.
Exactly. And then anyone who tries to offer a more nuanced perspective gets labeled a Russia understander or a Putin apologist.
Which, again, shuts down the conversation.
Right. And Pies also talks about the reaction to that speech on migration policy by Eckhard Sommer, the head of the BAMF, that's the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees.
I vaguely remember that.
Yeah, so he gave this speech where he was critical of certain migration policies, but he explicitly stated he was speaking in his private capacity.
So not representing the government's position.
Exactly. But there were all these calls for his resignation.
Really? Just for expressing his personal opinion.
Yeah. And Pies sees this as an attack on, the very freedom to think critically and speak your mind, especially someone with, direct experience in the field.
So even experts aren't allowed to disagree.
Right. And that's a big problem because Pies' main point here is that when we moralize politics, even if we're doing it with good intentions, it can lead to really bad consequences.
Because it prevents us from actually solving problems.
Exactly. If we can't even talk to each other, try to understand different viewpoints, how are we supposed to find solutions that work for everyone?
Good point. So what's the alternative? How should we approach these disagreements?
Well, Pies brings up John Stuart Mill again, who had this definition of the real morality of public discussion.
Okay, the real morality. What does that mean?
So it's not about condemning people. It's about representing their views fairly, not exaggerating them just to make them look bad.
So intellectual honesty, basically.
Exactly. And being willing to acknowledge when someone on the other side might actually have a good point.
That's a tough one sometimes.
It is. But that's what Pies is calling for. A better discourse culture. One where we see political competition not as a war, but as a way to cooperate and find better solutions.
So not enemies, but partners, even when we disagree.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important takeaway. So to sum all this up, a healthy democracy needs robust debate. We should see those ideological differences not as moral failings, but as opportunities to learn and to correct course.
Right, to find those better solutions we were talking about.
Exactly. And on that note, I want to leave you with a final thought to, chew on. How often do you see those political disagreements framed in those, black and white moral terms? Good versus evil, right? But what if we all made an effort to see our opponents, even the ones we really disagree with, as partners in this whole democracy thing?
And when we think they're wrong.
Even when we think they're wrong. Because maybe, just maybe, if we can shift that perspective, even just a little, we might actually be able to have more productive conversations. And who knows, maybe even find some solutions that work for everyone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.